When I was 18 years old, I made the single worst decision of my entire life. It is something that I still hate admitting to this day, but it is the catalyst for a series of events that would change my perception of safety forever. It was a cold, damp Friday night, and I was hanging out with two of my closest friends. We had absolutely nothing to do, and we were just driving around our suburban neighborhood, bored out of our minds. That was when we came up with an incredibly stupid, reckless plan. We decided to go to the local Walmart and steal a prepaid cell phone. At that age, you often feel completely invincible, like the rules of the world do not apply to you. We walked into the bright, fluorescently lit store, navigated our way to the electronics section, and located a phone sealed in a thick plastic clamshell package. I thought the plan was simple. I believed I could easily open the packaging, slip the phone into the front pocket of my hoodie, and walk out like nothing had happened. But the problem was, I had absolutely no idea how closely the loss prevention team monitored those security cameras. Before I could even reach the first set of double glass doors at the exit, two large men in plain clothes stepped in front of me, blocked my path, and quietly told me to follow them. Within less than an hour, I was sitting in the hard plastic backseat of a police cruiser, staring out the window at the very same parking lot I had driven into as a free, carefree teenager just a short while earlier. Because it was a Friday night, the entire situation was infinitely worse. I kept desperately telling myself that my parents would show up at the police station, pay a small fine or sign some paperwork, and take me straight home. But after I was transported to the county facility, processed and fingerprinted, an officer looked at me with a completely indifferent expression and told me I would be spending the entire weekend in the county jail. He explained that the court was closed for the weekend, and I would not be able to see a judge for a bail hearing until Monday morning. Hearing those words made my stomach twist into a painful, tight knot. I had never been in any real trouble before in my life. I had never even been suspended from school, and now I was being walked into a cold local jail in handcuffs over one of the most embarrassing decisions of my existence. The booking process felt like it took an eternity. The guards took all of my personal belongings, including my clothes, and handed me a stiff, scratchy orange jumpsuit that smelled strongly of cheap, industrial laundry detergent. That was the exact moment the gravity of the situation truly set in. I remember changing into that uniform and looking at myself in a small, scratched metal mirror on the wall, feeling completely sick to my stomach. When the guards finally escorted me back to the main holding day room, I realized within seconds that nobody else in there looked anything like me. I do not say that to imply I was better than anyone else in that room. I just mean that I looked incredibly young, visibly terrified, and completely out of place. Some of the men in that day room were much older, heavily tattooed, and had the hardened look of genuinely dangerous people. A lot of them were laughing and talking loudly, acting as if this jail was a familiar, comfortable place where they had spent time 10 times before. A few of them stared at me with pure annoyance. One group of men actually started making fun of me as I walked past, calling me pretty boy and laughing amongst themselves. I tried my absolute best not to react, but I could feel my face burning with heat. I sat down on a concrete bench, stared directly at the floor, and tried to look as calm and indifferent as possible. But I am certain that everyone in that room could tell I was absolutely terrified. After several hours had dragged by, a guard announced that we were allowed to make phone calls. I rushed over to the metal payphones and dialed my parents' home number. When my mom answered, the sheer comfort of her voice almost made me break down in tears right there in front of everyone. I quickly explained where I was and what had happened, and then my dad took the phone. He did not scream or yell at me, which somehow made the situation feel 100 times worse. He just sounded incredibly disappointed. He told me that they had already contacted an attorney, and that I would most likely be released on bail on Monday morning after I saw the judge. But Monday felt like it was a lifetime away. I wanted to beg him to find a way to get me out sooner, but I knew there was absolutely nothing anyone could do. When the call ended, I had to walk back into the crowded day room and pretend I was not on the verge of panicking. Later that night, the guards assigned me to a specific cell. My cellmate was a man who looked to be in his late 40s, and he told me his name was Bob. At first, I felt a slight sense of relief because Bob was not screaming or acting aggressive like some of the other inmates in the day room. He spoke in a very calm, quiet voice and treated me like a normal human being. He asked what I was in for, and I stupidly and honestly told him about the shoplifting incident. Bob laughed a little bit and told me that a petty theft charge was absolutely nothing to worry about, and that I would be just fine. For the first hour, he actually made me feel a lot less alone. He explained how the daily routine worked, told me when the meals would be served, and gave me advice on how to keep to myself so I would not attract any unwanted attention. I remember lying on my bunk thinking that maybe I had gotten incredibly lucky with my cellmate, but that feeling of safety did not last. As the hours dragged on, Bob began to get far too comfortable with me. He started asking extremely personal, probing questions. He wanted to know the exact neighborhood where I lived, if I had a girlfriend, what high school I went to, and if I still lived at home with my parents. I tried my best to give very vague, short answers, but he kept pressing for specific details. Then he started making strange comments about how young I looked and how a kid like me did not belong in a rough place like this. At first, it sounded like he was just a concerned elder, but quickly, his tone and words began to feel incredibly creepy. He began sitting right next to me on the edge of the lower bunk when we talked. He touched my shoulder multiple times during our conversations, and at one point, he placed his hand directly on my knee while laughing at a joke he had made. I pulled my leg away immediately, and when I did, he just smiled at me. It was a small, knowing smile, as if he knew exactly how uncomfortable he was making me and thoroughly enjoyed it. From that moment on, I dreaded every single second that the cell door was locked shut. The open day room, as terrible as it was, became the only place where I felt like I could actually breathe. I would count down the minutes until the cell doors were opened, just so I did not have to be trapped in that tiny, enclosed space alone with him. The days and nights began to blend together because there was no natural sunlight in that depressing facility. The bright fluorescent lights overhead never fully went off, and I barely slept a single wink. Every time I tried to close my eyes, I felt an intense paranoia that Bob was standing over me, watching me sleep. One night, in what felt like the absolute middle of the night, I suddenly opened my eyes. I looked up and saw Bob leaning over the edge of his top bunk, staring directly down at me in the dim, shadowed light. When he realized I was awake, he did not look away. He simply smiled and whispered that he could not sleep either. I did not say a word back to him. I just turned over and stared at the concrete wall until the morning guard shift arrived. Those 48 hours felt longer than any year of my life. By the time Monday morning finally arrived and I was escorted into the courtroom, I was completely physically and emotionally exhausted. I barely remember what the judge or the lawyers said. I just remember the wave of relief when I heard that I was being released. Later that afternoon, my dad picked me up from the facility. The car ride home was incredibly quiet. My dad was not angry, but he was deeply disappointed, and he seemed strangely sympathetic to how drained and broken I looked. I did not want to talk about the jail. I did not want to talk about Bob, and I did not want to talk about the theft. I just wanted to take a long, hot shower, sleep in my own comfortable bed, and pretend the entire weekend had been nothing more than a terrible nightmare. A few days passed, and I slowly started to feel like myself again, but then I received a notification on my personal Instagram account. It was a follow request from a very suspicious-looking profile. My account was public at the time, so getting random followers was not completely unusual, but this account had no real name, no posts, and the profile picture was just a dark, blurry photo of an empty, shadowed room. I decided to ignore the request. Later that night, I received a direct message from that exact same account. When I opened it, my heart stopped. It was a selfie of Bob. His face was positioned extremely close to the camera lens, and he had that exact same unsettling, creepy smile on his face that he had given me in the cell. Underneath the photo, he had typed a short message that read, "Miss you already." I felt completely violated and sick to my stomach. I quickly blocked the account and threw my phone onto my bed, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The absolute worst part of it was realizing that he somehow knew my real full name. I had no idea how he had managed to find my profile. 2 days after that, I came home from my part-time job in the late afternoon. It was a very foggy, gray day, and both of my parents were still at work. As I pulled my car into the driveway, I noticed a rusty, beat-up car parked directly across the street. The engine was turned off, and someone was sitting in the driver's seat with their heads slumped down low. I sat in my car for a moment, watching them. I could not make out their face through the heavy fog, but something about the way they were sitting there, completely motionless, made me feel incredibly uneasy. I got out of my car, ran up to the front door, went inside, and locked it securely behind me. A few minutes later, I was standing in the kitchen trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of my front doorknob rattling. Whoever was outside was not knocking or ringing the doorbell. They were slowly turning the metal knob back and forth, testing to see if the door was unlocked. After a few seconds, the rattling stopped. Not even 30 seconds later, I heard the exact same sound coming from the back door of the house. That was when the danger became entirely real. I realized someone was actively trying to find a way inside my home. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My voice was shaking, and I had to whisper because I was terrified that the person outside would hear me. I told the dispatcher that someone was trying to break into my home. While I was on the phone, the front doorbell suddenly rang. The dispatcher asked if I could look through a window to see who it was, but I told her I was far too terrified to go near the glass. I told her that I believed it was the man I had shared a cell with over the weekend. She told me to stay where I was, lock myself in a room, and wait for the officers to arrive. By the time the police cars pulled up with their lights flashing, the rusty car was gone, and there was nobody at the door. I walked outside and told the officers everything. I told them about my recent arrest, the weekend in jail, the creepy cellmate named Bob, the Instagram message, and the car I had seen outside. But the moment I admitted that I had just been released from jail, I felt their entire demeanor shift. They did not become rude, but they suddenly seemed much less interested in helping me. One of the officers asked if I was sure I was not just highly stressed from my weekend in custody, which made me incredibly angry. Another officer asked if I had given Bob my full name while we were in the cell. I told him absolutely not. They wrote down a basic report, handed me a slip of paper with a case number, and left. For the next week, nothing happened, and I slowly began to convince myself that the nightmare was finally over. Then, on a weekend night, I went out to a local dive bar with some friends. These were not the friends who knew about my arrest. Aside from my immediate family and the two friends who had been there that Friday night, I had not told a single soul about what had happened. We were standing near the pool tables, laughing and talking, when I happened to glance toward the far end of the dim bar. My heart sank. Sitting alone at a corner table was Bob. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled down low over his eyes and a dark jacket, almost like he was trying to hide his identity, but I recognized him instantly. He was not looking directly at me when I first noticed him, but a few seconds later, he slowly raised his head. When our eyes met, that same creepy smile spread across his face. The absolute terror must have been written all over my face, because my friends immediately asked me what was wrong. I lied and told them that there was an ex-girlfriend at the bar that I really did not want to see, and that I wanted to leave right away. We walked out through the front exit, and I kept looking over my shoulder, fully expecting Bob to step out of the shadows behind us. Once we reached the parking lot, I told my friends that I was going to call an Uber to take me home, but I begged them to wait with me until it arrived. The second I got into the back seat of the car, I called my parents and told them every single detail I had been hiding from them. That night, my parents decided that enough was enough. We went straight to the police precinct. This time, because my parents were with me, and I had a screenshot of the Instagram message ready, the officers took the situation much more seriously. I explained the attempted break-in, the digital messages, and the fact that he had followed me to a bar. I signed a formal, sworn statement, and within a few weeks I was able to secure a temporary restraining order. That was when the police revealed some shocking details to me. It turned out that Bob was not even his real name. I am not going to share his actual name here, but the police discovered he had a long criminal history. I also learned just how easy it is for a former inmate to find information about anyone booked into the system. Once he was finally released, he was able to search public arrest records or to discover my full name, which led him straight to my social media accounts and eventually to my home address. Thankfully, the restraining order seemed to work because I never saw him again. But for years after that, the fear stayed with me. Getting arrested for a stupid mistake at Walmart was humiliating, but the worst part of that entire experience had nothing to do with the court or the legal charges. It was the terrifying realization that one bad decision had locked me in a room with a dangerous predator, giving him just enough information to follow me back into my real life. The next experience I want to share is something I still struggle to talk about. To this day, whenever I begin to think about what could have happened to my friend Laura and me, I feel a wave of intense anxiety wash over me. It is a memory that I have tried to bury, but it always finds a way back to the surface. It all started last summer when I began dating a guy who lived about an hour away from my hometown. Our relationship only lasted for a few months, and if I am being completely honest with myself, it was just a rebound. The only reason I even mention him is because of the long drive I had to make every time I went to visit him. Most of that hour-long drive was incredibly boring. It was nothing but endless stretches of tall trees and massive empty grass fields. But roughly 15 minutes before I would reach his house, I would always drive past a giant, imposing building in the distance. From the highway, the building looked like something straight out of an old Gothic horror movie. It had high, arching roofs, incredibly small windows, and a massive stone cross mounted on the very highest peak. The architecture was both beautiful and deeply unsettling, and it completely fascinated me. One day, I asked him if he knew what the building was. He shrugged and told me he had no idea. He said he thought it might have been an old prison at some point, but he did not know for sure. He told me that for as long as he could remember, the building had been completely abandoned, and he had never cared enough to look into its history. That was one of the major differences between him and me. He could drive past a massive, mysterious structure his entire life and never give it a second thought, while I saw it once and immediately wanted to know every single thing about it. Even after he and I stopped talking, I could not get that old building out of my mind. I eventually told my best friend Laura about it, and she became just as intrigued as I was. We spent hours trying to search for information about it online, but we could not find any clear records of what the building had been used for. When we did not find any quick answers, we ended up giving up on the search, but we were not ready to give up on the building itself. That was when Laura made a suggestion that changed everything. She suggested that we should just drive out there and check it out in person. She argued that since it was abandoned, there would be nobody there to stop us, and we could easily take a look inside. I was very hesitant at first. I am not the type of person who takes big risks. I like to follow the rules, and the idea of trespassing in a giant abandoned building felt like a massive risk to me. Looking back now, I feel incredibly stupid for what we did next. But at the time, we decided that going in the middle of the night would be our best option. My flawed logic was that if there was any kind of security patrolling the area, they would surely be gone after dark. A few nights later, at around 1 o'clock in the morning, we finally made the drive. We packed 2 flashlights with brand new batteries, trying to get ourselves excited for a fun adventure. When we arrived, Laura parked her car on the shoulder of the road, far away from the building's entrance, just in case there were security cameras near the gates. It took us nearly 10 minutes of walking through the dark, damp grass to finally reach the heavy front doors. I looked around frantically for some kind of sign or plaque that would tell us what this place had been, but there was absolutely nothing. Even standing right on the front steps, we still had no clue what we were looking at. Laura stepped forward and reached for the heavy metal handle of the front door. To our absolute surprise, the door clicked and swung open. There was a lock on the frame, but it was completely unlatched. As the door opened, a wave of cold, musty air rushed out to greet us. The smell of rotting wood and decades of damp dust was completely overwhelming. We turned on our flashlights, and the bright beams cut through the darkness, illuminating millions of tiny dust particles floating in the air. Once we stepped inside, it became immediately obvious what the building had been. It was definitely an old prison. Directly ahead of us was a heavy metal door with thick iron bars over a small window. That door was also unlocked and standing slightly ajar. I started to feel a deep sense of unease settle into my chest, and I told Laura that maybe we should turn back. But Laura was filled with adrenaline and kept walking forward, so I reluctantly followed close behind her. We made our way through a series of smaller, decaying rooms before finally stepping into a massive open hall. This hall was lined with rows of small, dark cells. The floor was covered in heavy debris, with large chunks of concrete and plaster that had fallen from the ceiling scattered everywhere. The building was literally falling apart around us. I stopped walking and told Laura that I wanted to leave. I was terrified that a section of the ceiling could collapse on us at any moment. Laura just laughed, calling me a nervous wreck, but she promised that we would only stay for a few more minutes. I agreed, but I kept my flashlight aimed at the ceiling, my heart hammering in my chest. It could not have been more than 3 minutes later when a sudden, incredibly loud crashing sound echoed through the hollow halls. We both froze instantly. I was convinced that the building was collapsing, and the sheer terror I felt was indescribable. Laura tried to remain rational, whispering that it was probably just a piece of plaster falling somewhere in the distance. But the look I gave her made it clear that I was not staying a second longer. It was time to go. We quickly turned around and began retracing our steps back toward the front entrance. But as we approached the doorway of the massive cell block, Laura suddenly stopped. She grabbed my arm and whispered for me to look ahead. Standing at the far end of the dim room, illuminated only by the faint ambient light, was a person. I cannot even begin to describe the sheer terror of standing in an abandoned prison in the dead of night and realizing you are not alone. We stood frozen, staring at the silhouette. After a moment, the person slowly raised their hands in the air, as if to show they were unarmed, and spoke in a calm, soft voice. He told us his name was Mike, and that he did not want to hurt us. Laura, trying to sound brave, yelled back at him, asking why he was there, and warning him that we had pepper spray if he came any closer. Mike immediately tried to reassure us. He claimed that he was a security guard hired to watch over the building. He explained that a lot of teenagers had been breaking in lately, so the owners had hired him to patrol the property and detain anyone who trespassed until the police could arrive. He sounded incredibly calm and professional. He did not stutter or hesitate, and his smooth explanation almost made me believe him. I was terrified that I was about to be arrested, but Laura leaned in close to me and whispered that something felt completely wrong about this guy. Mike began walking slowly toward us, speaking in that same friendly, reassuring tone. He told us that he was going to escort us out of the building with just a warning, because we looked like nice girls, and there was no need to get the law involved. I felt a wave of relief and started thanking him, but Laura asked him to step aside so we could walk past him to the front door. That was when his behavior took a strange turn. He stopped and told us that we could not leave through the front door because the loud crash we had heard earlier was a massive section of the ceiling collapsing right in our exit path. He claimed the way was completely blocked and that he would have to lead us out through a much safer back exit. Laura remained highly skeptical, but I was so desperate to get out that I just wanted to follow him. As he walked past us to lead the way, I noticed that his clothes were incredibly strange for a security guard. He was wearing normal blue jeans, clean white sneakers, a dark hoodie, and a flannel shirt. He had no badge, no uniform, and no equipment. Laura pointed this out, asking why he was not in uniform. Mike just laughed and told us that since the job was incredibly boring, his boss let him wear whatever he wanted. He kept leading us deeper and deeper into the dark labyrinthine building, moving in the exact opposite direction of the exit we had used. Every time we asked how much further it was, he would just smile and tell us not to worry, because we were almost there. After a few minutes, we entered a very narrow, claustrophobic hallway with a single wooden door at the end. The hallway was so tight that we had to walk in a single file line. Mike reached the door, opened it, and revealed a steep concrete staircase leading down into a pitch-black basement. The darkness down there was absolute. Our flashlights could barely cut through it. Instead of walking down first, Mike stepped to the side, held the door open, and told us to go ahead of him. Laura stopped dead in her tracks. She asked him why on earth we would need to go down into a basement to exit the building. Mike just chuckled and told her she was being silly. But Laura refused to take another step. I tried to de-escalate the situation by asking Mike if he would lead the way down. He hesitated for a brief second before agreeing. He took 2 steps down the stairs and then suddenly stopped. He turned around and told us that he needed to make sure the door locked behind us so nobody else could slip in. He stepped back up to the landing, reached out, and grabbed my arm tightly. He began trying to pull me down onto the stairs. I froze in shock, but Laura reacted instantly. She let out a loud scream and shoved Mike with all her strength. Because she was standing on the higher ground of the landing, the push caught him off guard and made him stumble backward down the concrete steps, releasing his grip on my arm. Laura grabbed my hand and screamed for me to run. We fled back down the narrow hallway, sprinting as fast as our legs could carry us. We ran through the decaying rooms, through the cell block, and straight out of the front entrance. There was absolutely no collapsed ceiling in our path. The way was completely clear. We did not look back, but the entire time we were running, I felt a terrifying sensation, as if Mike was right behind me, his hand still gripping my arm. We burst through the front doors, ran through the damp grass to Laura's car, locked the doors, and sped away into the night. We spent the entire drive home checking our mirrors, terrified that he was somehow following us. A week later, I finally gathered the courage to call the local police department. I confessed to the officer that we had trespassed in the old prison and explained the entire encounter with the man named Mike, who claimed to be a security guard. The officer was completely silent for a moment. He then told me that the old prison had been completely abandoned for decades. There were no security guards, no patrols, and no surveillance cameras on the property. He told me that whoever we had met that night was a highly dangerous individual, and that we were incredibly lucky to have escaped with our lives. Hearing those words made me break down in tears. To this day, I still do not know who Mike really was, or what he was doing in that dark, abandoned basement. The thought of what would have happened if Laura had not pushed him still keeps me awake at night. Several years ago, I decided to make a massive, life-altering change. I packed up all of my personal belongings into a small moving truck and drove nearly 1,000 miles across the country. I had recently accepted a position as a corrections officer at a local county jail, hoping that a brand new career would give me a fresh start. I had only been working at the facility for about a week when I first crossed paths with an inmate named Edgar. By all accounts, Edgar seemed like a completely decent, ordinary man. Just because a person is locked up in a county jail does not automatically mean they are a dangerous or violent criminal. In Edgar's case, his file indicated that he was only serving a short sentence for a minor parole violation. Every single time our paths crossed in the hallways or the day room, Edgar was incredibly polite. He always addressed me as sir, followed every direct order to the letter, and never caused a single ounce of trouble for the shift staff. But during one of my very first weeks on duty, something happened that completely threw me off balance and made my blood run cold. I was walking down a narrow corridor when Edgar looked at me and, completely out of the blue, asked how Stan was doing. I stopped dead in my tracks and stared at him in complete disbelief. I do have a younger brother named Stan, but there was absolutely no logical way that Edgar could have possibly known his name. The jail where I worked was located nearly 1,000 miles away from my hometown, in a state I had never even visited before taking the job. I had not told a single one of my new coworkers about my family, and I had certainly never mentioned my brother to an inmate. I decided to ignore the question. I pretended I had not heard him over the noise of the facility, and went about my daily duties. I tried to convince myself that it was just an insane, one-in-a-million coincidence. I reasoned that he could have been talking about a different Stan, or perhaps I had simply misheard his words. But a few days later, my paths crossed with Edgar once again. As I walked past his cell block, he slowly looked up from his bunk, caught my eye, and asked me if Diana still lived by the lake. This time, all the air left my lungs. My mother's name is Diana, and she has lived in a small, isolated cabin by a quiet lake for over 20 years. I immediately pulled Edgar aside, away from the other inmates, and demanded to know how he knew that name. Edgar just shrugged his shoulders, gave me a calm, blank smile, and told me he had no idea what I was talking about. In jails and prison, there are always gossip chains where inmates share information about staff, but there was no possible way Edgar could have uncovered something this deeply personal. I had no active social media accounts. I never talked about my personal life at work, and absolutely nobody in this entire state knew my family. It felt like an absolute violation of my privacy, and it deeply unnerved me. I decided to do some private digging into Edgar's official file. I thought that maybe, by some bizarre stretch of the imagination, he had originally lived near my hometown before moving. But when I pulled up his records, I saw that Edgar had been born and raised right in the local area where the jail was located. He had a long record of minor offenses, but according to every official document, he had never once traveled outside of his home state. Then, a few days later, the psychological game escalated. Edgar saw me in the day room, walked up to the officer station, and asked me if my young nephew was still a major fan of baseball. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. My nephew is indeed obsessed with youth baseball. At this point, the situation was beyond disturbing. I went straight to my shift supervisor's office and explained the weird, highly specific comments Edgar had been making about my family members. But my supervisor just waved it off. She told me that inmates love to play psychological mind games with new officers to get under their skin and make them paranoid. She suggested that Edgar was probably just trying to get me to lose my temper and retaliate so he could file a massive lawsuit against the county. I did not really believe her theory, but I had to accept it because there was nothing else I could do. For the rest of his sentence, Edgar continued to be completely respectful and polite, always smiling whenever he saw me. But the constant tension I felt whenever he was nearby was unbearable. Not long after that, Edgar was scheduled to be released from custody. On the morning of his release, he walked past my desk to collect his personal property, looked me dead in the eye, and told me goodbye. But right before he stepped through the exit doors into the outside world, he leaned in and told me that maybe he would see me around. The way he smiled when he said those words felt incredibly ominous, and it left a heavy weight in my stomach. A few months passed, and I slowly began to relax and return to my normal routine. I was settling into my new home, and I had even started dating a wonderful woman who lived a few miles away. I began spending a few nights a week at her apartment. One quiet morning, while I was getting ready for work at her place, my phone buzzed with a notification from my home security system. Someone had tripped the sensor on my Ring camera at my house. When I opened the live video feed, I saw a man standing on my front porch, completely still. After a moment, he pressed the doorbell. He stood there waiting and then pressed it a second time. Then, he looked directly into the camera lens and in a very soft, calm voice, asked if anyone was home. He then began talking about how he was driving a truck around the neighborhood selling high-quality meat. He pointed off camera, claiming his truck was parked just down the street, and apologized for bothering me before slowly walking away. I watched the video and tried to brush it off. It is not uncommon for door-to-door salespeople to come by, even if this guy seemed a bit strange. He had his hood pulled up tight around his face, which made it impossible to see his features in the morning shadows. The very next night, I was staying at my girlfriend's apartment again. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, my phone buzzed with another security alert. Someone was at my front door. But when I pulled up the camera feed, the porch was completely empty. I figured it was just a glitch in the sensor, so I went back to sleep. But the following night, I was home alone at my house. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, my physical doorbell rang, echoing loudly through the quiet house. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my phone, and opened the Ring app. It was the exact same hooded man from the day before. Before I could say anything through the intercom, he rang the bell again. He spoke directly into the microphone, asking if anyone was home because he had some great meat in his truck that he wanted to sell. I was absolutely furious that someone was disturbing me at this hour. The man then leaned closer to the camera and told me I should open the door so I could see exactly what he had for sale. As he said this, I watched his hand reach out toward my doorknob. I immediately tapped the microphone button on my phone and yelled that I was a law enforcement officer, and that if he did not leave my property instantly, I would call the police. The man froze. Then, he slowly tilted his head upward, allowing the porch light to hit his face. He let out a massive, unsettling smile. It was Edgar, the polite inmate who knew everything about my family, was standing on my porch in the middle of the night. I felt a wave of pure terror wash over me. Edgar did not run or panic when I threatened to call the police. He simply turned around with agonizing slowness and began walking away. I watched the camera feed as he walked down my driveway and continued down the dark street. There was no truck parked anywhere in sight. He had walked to my house on foot in the dead of night. I spent the next day in a state of absolute panic. I called my brother Stan and asked him if he had ever met a man named Edgar, but Stan had absolutely no idea who he was. I even sent him a photo of Edgar from his mugshot, but Stan confirmed he had never seen him in his life. I went back to the jail and did some more unauthorized digging into Edgar's history. What I found was deeply disturbing. Edgar was essentially a ghost. He had no listed family members, no valid previous addresses, and when his parole officer had gone to check the address he had provided upon release, the home was completely abandoned. It was as if he did not exist outside of his arrests. A month later, the nightmare reached its peak. I was staying at my girlfriend's house late at night when her doorbell suddenly rang at 10:30. I rushed to the front door, thinking it might be a neighbor, but when I opened it, the porch was empty. I looked down the street and saw a figure walking away into the darkness. The person's size and build looked identical to Edgar, but it was too dark to be completely sure. I yelled out into the night, but the figure did not stop or turn around. I did not chase after them, but the realization that he might have tracked me to my girlfriend's house made me feel completely helpless. I stayed awake all night, staring at the door with a weapon in my hand, but nobody ever returned. To this day, I have never seen Edgar again. It is like he vanished off the face of the earth, but the terror of what he did has never left me. I am constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering how a random inmate from 1,000 miles away knew my mother's name, my brother's name, and my nephew's hobbies. The thought that he might one day show up at my mother's cabin by the lake is a nightmare that constantly keeps me awake. I can only pray that he was arrested in some other town under a different name. I can only hope that he is currently locked away where he can never threaten or hurt my family ever again. The lingering questions still keep me awake at night, wondering how he crossed our lives. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.